Jesse James was famous for running, from pauses, from Pinkertons, from the crowds who wanted him dead, and from the ones eager to turn him into a legend. But when Jesse died, all that running ended in one shot. And just like that, the crowd came running to him. It happened in St. Joseph, Missouri. The blood was still drying on Jesse's hair, pooling under a cheap rug in his cramped front parlor, when the first knock hit the door. Barely a breath later, the word was out. Jesse James, America's most wanted outlaw, gunned down in his own house by a so-called friend. News moved faster than a telegram. Within minutes, people gathered at the windows, pressing in for a glimpse. Some came out of fear, some out of hate, but most out of that old-fashioned curiosity that never really goes away. This, right here, isn't the part of the story Hollywood likes to show. The movies give you the gunshot, maybe a slow fade-out, then roll credits. The real story is a lot sweatier, smellier, and more awkward, and it starts in that little front parlor where the legend was suddenly just a body, not even a heroic one. Half-dressed, freshly dead, turned into a public exhibit while strangers shuffled in for a closer look. Dignity drained out minute by minute. If you'd been there in April 1882, you wouldn't get the Jesse James of the dime novel. You'd see a 34-year-old man sprawled on his side, face slack, eyes half open, a dark hole just behind his ear. Blood still tracked down his neck, matting his hair, soaking his shirt collar. The wound wasn't neat. Bone and brain matter splattered the faded wallpaper, sticky puddles seeping from under his cheek. The air was thick with the metallic stench of blood, cheap tobacco, and the sharper note of fear. Jesse's wife Z and their children were home when the shot was fired. They didn't get time for grief or rage. Lawmen were already pounding at the door. Neighbors were whispering about the famous corpse inside. The first problem wasn't emotional. It was practical. What do you do with a dead body everyone in town wants to see? This wasn't an era of quick 911 calls or professional crews in hazmat suits. In St. Joseph, death was home business, handled with whatever hands and kitchen tools you had. Before the mortician could even arrive, Jesse's family had to wrestle with the mess. Someone grabbed a bucket, a rough linen rag. No hot water, just cold. Straight from the pump outside, splashed over Jesse's scalp in a desperate attempt to clean away blood that only pooled deeper around his ear. Soaking the carpet, the bullet wound gaped, rimmed in purple and black, still oozing. The smell started to shift too, from bright iron tang to something heavier and sour, unmistakably final. Outside, the crowd didn't let up. Reporters jostled for a look. Neighbors spread rumors, swearing those were Jesse's boots, or that the body was just a stand-in. The real Jesse already halfway to Texas. Inside, though, the reality was simple and rough. A body cooling too fast for comfort, blood drying in sticky patches, a bullet wound that didn't offer any romance. Just mess. And beyond the door, the first wave of gawkers waited, itching to see the infamous outlaw up close, maybe even close enough to touch. If you think Jesse's legend was all about violence, you haven't seen what a crowd can do to a corpse. The real spectacle was just getting started. Once the initial shock wore off, the practical nightmare kicked in. Nobody in a Western movie ever bothers to show this part. Jesse's body, half washed and already stiffening, had to be made presentable and fast. In 1882, funeral director meant the local cabinet maker who sometimes doubled as undertaker. There were no fancy tools, no refrigeration, no privacy. The family's parlor turned into a grim stage for washing, dressing, and preserving Missouri's most notorious corpse, while an impatient audience gathered outside. The cleaning was as crude as you'd expect. More water fetched, now colder, trying to work dark stains from Jesse's neck and hair with a linen square that quickly went from pink to brown to useless. Strips of scalp and matted hair refused to come clean. The wound, ugly and obvious, stayed open. No makeup to cover, swelling or mottled jaw. Just a collar pulled high and hair smoothed down in the hope of fooling the curious. Then came the embalming. This wasn't some secret scientific procedure. In a small Missouri town, the undertaker was more practiced at building pine boxes than preserving bodies. Embalming in 1882 was a bucket of harsh chemicals, arsenic, carbolic acid, alcohol, mixed with guesswork. A hand-pump syringe drove fluid into Jesse's veins. The air burned with the mix of blood and sharp medicinal fumes. Was it effective? Barely. The point wasn't to preserve Jesse for eternity. It was just to keep the body viewable long enough for the entire population of St. Joseph to file past. Dressing the body wasn't much smoother. The family picked a shirt, stiff and likely still stained, folded Jesse's hands to hide the dirt under his nails, tried to conceal the bullet wound with a collar. But if you leaned in, you could still see it. Hollywood likes to skip this detail, but there's no graceful way to arrange a body shot in the head, especially when the crowd expects to see proof. Every adjustment risked reopening a wound or flaking off dried blood, and the undertaker had to move fast because the line outside was only getting longer. When the doors finally opened, word had spread faster than the body could be cleaned. Men, women, children packed into the parlor, hats in hand, eyes wide. The air thickened, sweat, candle wax, sharp chemical tang, and something unmistakably human, the first hint of rot. Some folks whispered, some gagged at the smell, some pressed so close their sweat mixed with embalming residue. The whole scene was part carnival, part crime exhibit, part shoddy museum. This is the moment where Jesse James's legend left flesh and entered spectacle. For 2 decades, he'd been the man no one could catch. Now, not even his own parlor could keep the crowds away. The myth of the outlaw finally met the reality of the corpse. Sweatier, stickier, and a lot harder to clean up than any legend lets on. As the day dragged on, the problems only piled up. Rumors grew. Dignity slipped away. The body itself began to betray the illusion, one oozing wound and sour chemical stench at a time. By afternoon, the spectacle reached a fever pitch. The parlor, designed for a handful of mourners, became a pressure cooker. The crowd pushed in. Neighbors elbowed past strangers, desperate for a closer look. Whispers flew. Was it really Jesse in the box? Had the Ford brothers swapped the body? Was the bullet wound the right shape and size? Inside, Jesse's body was losing the battle. Even with embalming, the wound behind his ear kept seeping, staining the linen beneath his head. The chemical mix in his veins fought a losing war against biology and springtime heat. The smell got sharper, mixing blood, chemicals, and the first hints of decomposition. Candle wax dripped onto the parlor table, adding to the stew of odors. The crowd got bolder. Control slipped away from the family. Some visitors leaned in close, peering at the wound, reaching out to touch the coffin, or even Jesse's hand. Like they needed physical proof this wasn't some elaborate trick. There were rumors, never fully proven, but gleefully repeated, that a few tried to snip a lock of hair or pocket a bloodied rag. Mostly, It was just eyes and words. Hundreds of people taking their own inventory, looking for something extraordinary and finding, in the end, a battered, leaking, very human corpse. Up close, the glamour evaporated. Jesse's skin took on a waxy, mottled pallor. Rigor mortis set in, stiffening his jaw and fingers. The legendary wound was just a ragged, bruised hole, weeping despite the embalmer's best efforts. Sweat from the crowd condensed on the coffin, sometimes mixing with blood or chemical residue as people shuffled through. The brave ones leaned in. The faint of heart stumbled back, pale and queasy. No one worried about contagion. It was before germ theory, at least in Missouri. But with the heat, the crowd, the open wounds, this little spectacle became a public health hazard, a sticky communion between the living and the dead. And the press loved every minute. Reporters scribbled down their versions for the morning papers. Some accused the family of charging admission, not likely, but the rumor stuck. Some said the Ford brothers staged the whole affair, swapping bodies to hide the truth. The myth-making started before Jesse was even in the ground. Claims that he'd survived, or that the wounds proved nothing, or that the corpse was a fake. The legend tangled with reality, inseparable, as Jesse's body sat on display, already melting into rumor. By evening, the body had to be removed. The coffin was heavy. Jesse was stiffening fast, the wound still leaking despite every attempt to make him presentable. Family and attendants carried him out through a back door, away from the last gawkers. He was buried first in the family yard, under a plain marker, no grand monument, just a patch of dirt and a memory already twisted by spectacle. The rumors never stopped. For decades, people insisted Jesse was never in that grave, that he'd escaped, or that the family swapped corpses. Later, his body would even be exhumed for testing, and the legend would mutate all over again. But here's the harshest reality. The man who spent half his life running from the mob couldn't escape becoming a public exhibit in death. His final indignity wasn't the bullet or the betrayal. It was the line of neighbors and strangers breathing in the proof of his mortality, staring at his wounds, and leaving with a first-hand story of what a dead outlaw really looked and smelled like. So, if you want the raw truth behind the legend, start here. Jesse James's myth wasn't forged only by the gunshot or the years of outlaw bravado, but by the sticky, stinking spectacle of his corpse on display. The legend clung as much to the smell of embalming fluid and sweat as to any ballad or dime novel. In the end, the most famous outlaw in America was just another body in a crowded room, his final story written in blood, cold water, and the awkward aftermath almost no one wants to remember. Want more unsanitized physical history, dark, strange, and more human than legend? Subscribe for the next one. Because the truth of the American outlaw isn't in the movies. It's right here, in the mess left behind.